Most people treat their Apple ID like a lock on a door. They set a password, maybe turn on two-factor authentication, and then never think about it again. What they do not think about is the window they left open next to that door. That window is Safari. And the way most iPhone and Mac users have Safari configured right now, it is providing more pathways into your Apple ID and your personal data than Apple ever intended you to leave open by default. Your Apple ID is not just a login. It is the master key to your entire digital life on Apple's ecosystem. It controls your iCloud storage and everything in it. Your photos, your messages, your notes, your contacts, your health data, your saved passwords through iCloud Keychain, your Apple Pay, your device locations through Find My. If someone gains access to your Apple ID, they gain access to all of that simultaneously. The damage that follows a compromised Apple ID is not limited to one account or one app. It cascades across everything Apple touches in your life, and for most people, that is a very large surface area. Safari is the browser that most iPhone and Mac users use for the majority of their web browsing. It is deeply integrated with Apple's ecosystem in ways that are genuinely useful and in ways that create specific risks that most users have never thought about. The settings that govern how Safari handles your data, your browsing history, your cookies, your saved passwords, and your interactions with websites are not configured by default for maximum security. They are configured for maximum convenience. And in 2026, with phishing attacks growing more sophisticated, with credential harvesting at unprecedented scale, and with cross-site tracking, building detailed profiles of your behavior that can be exploited in ways that circle back to your Apple ID, the difference between a convenience-first configuration and a security-first configuration matters enormously. Here are the specific Safari settings you need to review and change right now, with exact navigation paths, and a clear explanation of why each one matters for your Apple ID security and your broader digital safety. The first and most important setting is Prevent Cross-Site Tracking. On iPhone, this is found at Settings, then Safari, then scroll down to Privacy and Security, then make sure Prevent Cross-Site Tracking is toggled on. On Mac, it is in Safari, then Settings, then Privacy, then check Prevent Cross-Site Tracking. This setting controls whether Safari allows advertisers and data brokers to follow your activity from one website to another using tracking cookies and similar technologies. Most iPhone users assume this setting is on because Apple has been marketing iPhone privacy features heavily for several years. It is on by default on recent iOS versions, but it gets turned off more often than people realize. Some websites instruct users to disable this setting to access certain content. Some third-party apps that open web content in Safari can affect this setting. And anytime you reset Safari settings or restore your iPhone, the default state may differ from what you had before. Check it right now, regardless of whether you think it is on. The reason this matters for your Apple ID specifically is less obvious than it might seem. Cross-site tracking allows companies to build profiles of your browsing behavior across the web. That profile data is commercially valuable for advertising purposes, but it is also exploitable in the context of phishing attacks. Sophisticated phishing operations in 2025 and 2026 have increasingly used behavioral data to craft highly personalized phishing attempts that reference specific websites you recently visited, purchases you recently made, or services you recently signed up for. The more behavioral data that exists about you, the more convincing a targeted phishing attempt against your Apple ID can be made. Preventing cross-site tracking removes one of the primary inputs into that profile building. The second setting is Hide IP Address. On iPhone, this is found at Settings, then Safari, then Hide IP Address. On Mac, it is in Safari, then Settings, then Privacy, then Hide IP Address. When this setting is enabled, Safari routes your web requests through Apple's servers to hide your IP address from trackers and websites you visit. Your actual IP address reveals information, including your approximate geographic location and your internet service provider, both of which are useful data points for building a profile that can be used in social engineering attacks. Apple offers two options here depending on whether you have iCloud Plus. If you have iCloud Plus, you can use iCloud Private Relay, which hides your IP address from both trackers and the websites you visit. If you do not have iCloud Plus, the free option hides your IP address from trackers only, not from the websites themselves. Either option is better than the default of hiding nothing. Set this to the most protective option available to you. The feature is specifically designed to reduce the amount of location and identity information that flows out of your device with every web request you make. The third setting is Fraudulent Website Warning. On iPhone, this is at Settings, then Safari, then Fraudulent Website Warning. Make sure it is toggled on. On Mac, it is in Safari, then Settings, then Security, then Warn when visiting a fraudulent website. This setting causes Safari to check websites you visit against a database of known phishing and malicious sites and warn you before loading pages that have been identified as dangerous. This is a direct Apple ID protection feature in practice because the single most common pathway through which Apple IDs are compromised is phishing websites that impersonate Apple's login page. These sites look identical to the real Apple sign-in page. They use similar domain names. They use Apple's visual design. They present a login prompt that looks exactly like what you see when you sign into iCloud. When you enter your Apple ID and password on one of these pages, that information goes directly to whoever built the phishing site, rather than to Apple. The fraudulent website warning is the browser's first line of defense against this attack. It should always be on. Check it right now. The fourth setting is autofill for passwords, and specifically which passwords Safari is willing to save and automatically fill. On iPhone, this is found at Settings, then Safari, then Autofill. You will see options for using contact information, credit cards, and passwords. The passwords option is the one to focus on here. Safari's built-in password manager through iCloud Keychain is generally a secure way to store and autofill passwords because the data is end-to-end encrypted and protected by Face ID or Touch ID before it will autofill. What creates risk is if you are saving passwords in Safari that are not protected by strong, unique credentials. The specific risk to your Apple ID from autofill comes from a different direction. If a sophisticated phishing site loads in Safari and manages to trigger an autofill prompt for a domain that closely resembles Apple's, a user who taps the autofill option without checking the domain carefully can have their Apple ID credentials entered automatically into a phishing site. Safari's own protections try to prevent this by matching autofill suggestions to the exact domain of the site, but the defense is not perfect. The protective habit to develop is always checking the domain in Safari's address bar before accepting any autofill suggestion for credentials, and specifically before accepting any prompt that asks for your Apple ID email and password. The fifth setting is JavaScript, which is a more aggressive step that most users will not want to take, but that is worth understanding. JavaScript is the programming language that powers almost all modern web functionality. It is also the primary vehicle through which malicious web content attempts to run code in your browser. Disabling JavaScript in Safari eliminates the vast majority of the web's interactivity, making many sites non-functional, but it also eliminates a very large attack surface. On iPhone, the option to disable JavaScript is in Settings, then Safari, then Advanced, then JavaScript. On Mac, it is in Safari, then Settings, then Security, then Uncheck, Enable JavaScript. For most users, the right approach is not to disable JavaScript entirely, but to understand that it exists as an option for specific high-security situations, such as when you're browsing on an unfamiliar or untrusted network, or when you are visiting a site where you need to enter particularly sensitive credentials. Keeping JavaScript enabled for normal browsing and knowing that you can turn it off temporarily when the situation warrants. It is a more practical security posture than leaving it fully on in all contexts without awareness of what it enables. Beyond these specific Safari settings, two related practices matter enormously for protecting your Apple ID. The first is understanding the lock screen access that Safari and Safari-related features have on your iPhone. When your phone is locked, certain features remain accessible. If you have not restricted lock screen access aggressively, Safari-saved passwords or autofill prompts could theoretically be accessible in ways that create risk if your physical device is compromised. Go to Settings then, Face ID, and Passcode, and review what is allowed when the device is locked. Limiting lock screen access for everything except essential features reduces the risk that physical access to your device translates into access to your credentials. The second related practice is enabling advanced data protection for iCloud, which takes your Apple ID security to a fundamentally higher level by extending end-to-end encryption to almost all of the data stored in iCloud, including iCloud backups, which are not end-to-end encrypted by default. This setting is found at Settings, then your name, then iCloud, then Advanced Data Protection. Enabling it means that even if someone gains access to Apple's servers, they cannot read your iCloud data without your device-based encryption keys. For users who store sensitive data in iCloud, which is most people who use an iPhone seriously, this is one of the most impactful single security improvements available. The Safari settings described in this script cover cross-site tracking prevention, IP address hiding, fraudulent website warnings, autofill credential practices, and JavaScript awareness. Each one addresses a specific pathway through which your Apple ID and your broader Apple ecosystem can be compromised through your browser. None of them is difficult to configure. All of them together take under 10 minutes to review and set correctly. Your Apple ID is the master key to your digital life. Safari is the window that most people leave partially open next to the door they locked carefully. Close the window right now. Check these settings today before you open your browser again, and well before the next phishing attempt lands in a form convincing enough to catch you off guard. There is one more dimension of Safari security that deserves specific attention because it is new in 2026, because it directly addresses a threat vector that has grown significantly over the past year. Apple introduced a feature called Lockdown Mode, specifically for users who face elevated risk of sophisticated targeted attacks, including journalists, activists, and anyone who believes they may be specifically targeted by state-level or criminal threat actors. Lockdown mode is not appropriate for most everyday users because it disables a significant amount of web functionality in Safari and other apps to reduce attack surface, but knowing it exists and knowing where to find it is valuable for anyone whose threat model includes serious targeted risk. For users who want a meaningful security upgrade without the restrictions of lockdown mode, Safari's Reader Mode deserves attention as an underused security tool. When you open a web page in Reader Mode, Safari strips away all of the extraneous code, advertising, tracking scripts, and other content that surrounds the main article or information you're trying to read. This dramatically reduces the amount of code that runs on your device when you visit a web page, and by extension, reduces the potential attack surface that any malicious code embedded in that page could exploit. You can enable Reader Mode automatically for all websites by going to Settings, then Safari, then Reader, and toggling on Automatically Use Reader. This will not work on all sites, but on the sites where it does work, it provides a meaningfully cleaner and safer browsing experience. The connection between these Safari settings and your Apple ID security is most clearly illustrated by understanding the attack sequence that sophisticated Apple ID phishing operations use in 2025 and 2026. The attack does not start with a phishing email that obviously looks suspicious. It starts with behavioral data collected through cross-site tracking that tells the attacker what Apple services you use, what purchases you have recently made, and what your browsing patterns look like. It continues with a phishing attempt that is personalized using that data, referencing a specific recent purchase or a specific Apple service in ways that make the message feel legitimate. It culminates on a phishing site designed to pass a quick visual inspection, hosted on a domain close enough to Apple's real domains to fool someone who is not specifically checking. Every setting described in this script interrupts one or more steps in that attack sequence. Preventing cross-site tracking limits the behavioral data the attacker can collect. Hiding your IP address limits the geographic and network identity data that supplements that profile. The fraudulent website warning catches known phishing domains before you enter your credentials. Strong autofill practices prevent credential entry on unverified domains. Understanding JavaScript's role in malicious web content helps you make informed decisions about when to reduce your exposure. Your Apple ID security in 2026 is not determined solely by your password strength or whether you have two-factor authentication enabled. It is also determined by how you browse, what Safari is allowed to do in the background of every page you visit, and whether the browser you trust with your credentials is configured to protect them. 15 minutes spent on these settings today is time invested in preventing an incident that could compromise years of personal data, financial information, and digital identity in a single successful attack. Start with Prevent Cross-Site Tracking, then move to Hide IP Address, then Fraudulent Website Warning, then review your autofill settings carefully. Then enable Advanced Data Protection for iCloud if you have not already done so. Each individual step takes well under 2 minutes to complete. Together, they represent a meaningfully more secure Safari and Apple ID configuration than what most iPhone users have running right now on their devices. Change the settings today. Share this with every Apple user in your life who has never thought to check these configurations. And check them again anytime a major iOS update arrives, because new features sometimes introduce new defaults that deserve the same scrutiny you're giving these ones, right?